Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Geneva Dialogue Podcast, a series of podcasts and scripted conversations with practitioners, experts from different fields. For those who are not familiar with the process, Geneva Dialogue on Responsible Behavior in Cyberspace is an international process launched by the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs and implemented by DiploFoundation with the support of several partners, where we try to map different roles and responsibilities of different actors to reduce cyber risks, to implement the agreed cyber norms, and basically to discuss what we can do to enhance security and stability in cyberspace. Today, the fifth episode, we would like to specifically zoom into the work of the open source software community, also to discuss what's going on given the growing regulatory pressure on the community, but also to discuss the future in the light of the current geopolitical situation. And I'm really happy to introduce our guest today. So please welcome Mirko Boehm, Senior Director for Community Development at Linux Foundation, and also one of the members of the Geneva Dialogue.
Yeah, thank you for having me today.
Before we actually go to the question, Mirko, I was checking also your page at the Linux Foundation, and I found out that you're also a visiting lecturer and researcher on free and open source software at the Technical University of Berlin. I didn't know that actually something like this exists in our academic curricula. So maybe you just briefly unpack what specifically do you teach, and is it a really separate standalone course on the open source software community or a part of sort of a broader course?
It's a standalone course on, especially on the relationship between open source development and innovation and intellectual property management, which is one of the key aspects of how open source influences society. So we sometimes seem to think of open source mostly as technology and software that magically changes the world in a positive way. But the driving forces behind that are, for a large part, economic. One essential aspect here is that open source communities produce software in a mostly out of their private interests that is a public good, and it's quite fascinating for economists. And we're offering this course to students of all courses of study, so engineers, sciences, social studies, etc. And it's always quite fascinating because the topic of the course attracts students that are quite enthusiastic about societal change and the impact of open source. So we have quite some engaged discussions there.
Mm-hmm. I like the angle that you're looking at, that the open source, not as just the tech, but a broader societal and economic something that we have in our life. But is it as sort of the executive education, or also for those who get in the first degree of the higher education?
It is focused on master level students. We sometimes have bachelor students if there's enough room, but usually it's in your second tier of study.
Interesting. I certainly did not see anything like this when I was getting my master, and I don't consider myself really, really old. So I just recently graduated, I think like 7-8 years ago, and still that was not really existent before.
It's quite unique. That's what also our attendants tell me. Both what we're teaching and a course that really focuses on open source as a driver of innovation. I think we're the only course that I'm aware of that does that, at least nearby in Europe.
That's really, really cool. Well, I'm really excited about today's conversation also because I really love to learn myself about different aspects. And before we go into more policy aspects, again, because now we're going to discuss the technical issues only, but I wanted to, maybe you would briefly share what is the Linux Foundation? And for those especially who might know that there might be different communities operating in the open source software field, how is Linux Foundation different from other open source software communities? So what's the difference?
Okay, so the Linux Foundation is the world's largest host of open source projects. So we host almost 1,000 projects. When we say we host, that means these projects are part of our wider organization. Technically, they're like organized under the Linux Foundation, and the projects operate relatively independently for their technical development processes, and we coordinate all the like event management, administrative, and legal aspects for the projects, which is a service function, if you will. So we are supporting the projects, and most of our projects are very widely adopted across the open source ecosystem. The name Linux comes from the Linux operating system, which is how our organization started. And over time, we developed a very diverse portfolio of technologies, and many of them are really, really widely used and quite critical. How's that different from other open source communities? Maybe the first thing to be aware of is that there's no such thing as the open source community. It's a very diverse and widespread network of more or less independent organizations that are all self-governed. There's no overarching like arbiter in the open source ecosystem. And we are one part of that. So we represent the projects that we host, but there are other organizations similar to us that host other project portfolios. And we're technically then like sister organizations in a way. And we maintain friendly relationships, but we're almost like sovereign states in that regard, right? And the Linux Foundation is one relatively large organization in this space. So we're not different from other open source communities. We play a very specific role. We facilitate the projects in our portfolio, and we represent those projects. But we don't claim, for example, to speak for the whole open source ecosystem.
I like how you made this analogy to sovereign states, to the Westphalian system between the open source community and the international relations. Well noted that indeed it's something that is not centralized. I mean, the community itself. And I think that's what really makes it fascinating as well. But maybe you would share what are the kind of relationships, if there are any relationships at all, between the Linux Foundation and other entities, communities that exist in this field? How do you cooperate with others, or if there's any cooperation exist at all?
So first, I mean, collaboration is in a way the bread and butter of the open source community. This is really like at the heart of what we do. And that means we pretty much always collaborate pretty openly with like-minded organizations. The rules of open source are very simple in a way. We release our software so that anybody can use it for any purpose. And our development processes are organized in a way that any interested party that wants to contribute has the ability to do so. And as long as any other organization follows a similar basic set of principles, it's very easy for us to work with them. So we have very good relationships with other open source foundations, especially if they complement what we do. So the Rust Foundation or the Python Software Foundation are organizations that we have very friendly relationships with. And sometimes when we engage in, for example, regulatory discussions, etc., we like to speak with a coordinated voice. So we can't speak with one voice. As I said, there is no overarching government, but we can align our positions, because generally the interests of the wider open source ecosystem are usually pretty much aligned. We want to make sure that regulation supports what we're doing, because we believe it has a positive impact on society, and that it doesn't get in the way, if you will. So we have quite deep relationships for engaging in policy discussions. And it's driven in a way as a coalition of interested parties. So yeah, quite a positive experience from my perspective. And I can say that my impression is that even policymakers appreciate that, because they, even though open source is such a bunch of like widely diverse and different organizations, we're able to present those basic principles where we all agree in a more or less aligned way. And for that, this horizontal collaboration between open source organizations is quite important.
Yeah, but if you speak with the one voice, I think that for politicians and policymakers, it's really easy to deal with. Because still, I think open source community, when you bring this to the table, it's really a non-construct to many policymakers as something as a having one face. But in terms of the security cooperation, is there a common thing that a project may have some interdependencies coming from the other platforms, and thus there might be necessity to cooperate within, as a Linux foundation and the other platform in security matters, for instance, where vulnerability was found or something already sort of in terms of the impact has been caused to the end users.
The dynamics of the supply chain when it comes to cybersecurity are actually quite complex, especially when it comes to open source, because the nature of open source is that we all develop components that are very widely used and end up in products. The products may be open source themselves, or commercial manufacturers may integrate what we develop into their products and release them as other products. But this whole network of upstream components that somebody pulls to integrate into a product comes from various different organizations. So it comes from us, but also from volunteer developer communities that don't have any legal organization behind them, from individuals or from other open source foundations. And the nature of the open source supply chain is a little bit that you pull from all of them and you integrate a huge amount of dependencies into pretty much all products today. And as a result, it's very difficult to coordinate security in one central place. What we do instead is we focus on the structure of the supply chain. We say who pulls software from whom, who consumes it from where, and make sure that these connections, these transactions between upstream communities and manufacturers, that we maintain security there. And this is reflected in recent regulation. If you look at the EU with the Cyber Resilience Act, where they call our side of the picture open source software stewards. And then on the other side, we have manufacturers. And the EU very clearly delineated that the responsibility for cybersecurity is with the manufacturers that consume from open source. And the open source community support the manufacturers, but it's always important to keep in mind that we don't create directly marketed products. We mostly create components. We sometimes create technologies that even individual citizens can use, but they're not sold in the market in that regard. And so since most regulation hinges responsibility for cybersecurity on bringing a product into the market, that's not what we do. However, we understand that we have a very strong role in supporting manufacturers in building secure products. And a lot of this is tracing and tracking vulnerabilities if they occur, maintaining a high quality of the software during the development process, having transparency over what gets integrated and what is a part of a release, etc. And in fact, I think the open source community is leading the way here with many of the best practices developed and recommended to projects to adopt. But there's still a lot of work to be done, to be short here.
But with regard to the different sort of the functions that you do, helping different maintainers keep the projects, is helping them tracking different interdependencies as a part of the support that you provide to them. I mean, doing something like as a SBOM, but in the context of the open source community.
Yeah, so maybe for background here, the drive to have SBOMs in software releases actually, I think, is for a good part coming from the open source community. Like we document our releases pretty well. And also, of course, when we release software, it is as transparent as it gets, because you get all the individual building blocks of how the software work and you build it together yourself. So not only do we give you release notes, we also give you the opportunity to look directly into the software source code and see how it's working. So at this level, the transparency about what is in the software is relatively high. However, it requires a lot of expertise to really assess that yourself. And so we're supporting with documentation, release notes, and during the maintenance of the software with code reviews, etc., to attain a high level of cybersecurity. So this is something that has been developed in the open source community for a long time. On top of that, we have initiatives like the Open Source Security Foundation, OpenSSF, that develops best practice recommendations and certification schemes like a best practices badge that projects can, like a checklist that projects can go through to make sure that their projects are developed in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
And this has really, like, it's a soft influence, it's a recommendation, but it has a lot of influence on the ecosystem. Lots of projects are communicating on their website that they fulfill the requirements of the recommendations, and that they fulfill the recommendations is not a requirement. And this is something that we drive. The OpenSSF is a Linux Foundation organization.
Thank you for that. I'd like to now maybe to zoom into more closely on the regulation. And you also mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act. So for those who are familiar with the law, with the LimeWire legislation that was adopted in the European Union and has extraterritorial effect practically for many other jurisdictions beyond the European Union and the manufacturers that are based outside. The law created first drafts of this legislation, created a lot of a discussion across the companies, the manufacturers, but also across open source communities and those who contribute with the projects to the community, that the law introduces sort of the obligations indirectly to the open source community. And that was I think we've seen sort of the backlash from those communities that probably not the right approach. So I wanted to ask you, knowing that the Linux Foundation actually took a really active position to speak as a one voice and to respond to and also comment on different parts of the first drafts of the legislation back to the policymakers. So retrospectively, maybe you would share a little bit more. What was the process at the Linux Foundation and your team with your teammates to actually digest what is inside of this law? Which risks did you see before? And how was it really difficult to understand? Maybe did you consult with directly with the policymakers, with the European Commission or the national bodies? So just wonder how was the process internally was organized for you?
So I'd like to begin with saying that we don't consider ourselves a lobbying organization. As I explained earlier, our mission is really to support our projects and to facilitate the collaboration in developing open source technology. So with that in mind, we usually engage in political and regulatory debates only if there's a concrete interest that affects the open source ecosystem, especially our projects. And the initial draft of the Cyber Resilience Act, however, was that situation because it contained concepts that would basically have placed the responsibility for cybersecurity vulnerabilities with the entity that first releases the software, which are often the open source communities. And from our perspective, open source communities are almost exclusively non-profit organizations that are built on voluntary contributions from individuals and from companies. So they're not really well suited to be responsible for downstream problems, for example, cybersecurity issues that originate in the software. So the first step was, of course, the realization that this is happening. It caused a bit of, I wouldn't say panic, but excitement that something needed to be done about that. And then we realized that at this time, we were not really well set up, we meaning the various open source organizations with their projects that they're responsible for, to speak with one voice. So one thing that the initial draft of the Cyber Resilience Act has triggered is that we got a bit closer together and organized that in a task force of various open source organizations that then work together to develop this joint position. With that group, we then engaged in and communicated with policymakers involved in the Cyber Resilience Act. And yes, as you asked, there was a lot of interest to get input from our side, and we were able to clear up some of the misunderstandings about how open source works. For example, there's an issue when you look at this from the outside, that you see a lot of large companies involved. And so it may appear to you that the projects are in a way dominated by big entities. And that's, from a contribution perspective, it's possible that individual projects get a lot of contributions from a large tech company. But still, our projects are organized in a way that collaboration is open for any participant, and that the results can be used for anybody for any purpose. And so it took a bit of time to understand that we're exactly a way to disconnect the ownership of the software from who can use the software for what purpose. And that with this in mind, it is less important who owns the copyright, because we all release the outcome as under an open source license. And understanding how the market works, how open source communities introduce software into the supply chain, how manufacturers then take that and make commercial products out of that, etc. It took a bit of time and discussion. However, the concerns that we raised were heard. Almost all of the concerns have been addressed. Now, as it is with the political process, it's not that everything we suggested was also taken into account. But we made huge progress from my perspective compared to the original drafts. Yeah, so in short, we got our act together. We collaborated horizontally to come up with unified positions that we presented to the European Commission. We did that. We were listened to, and as a result, we got a better Cyber Resilience Act, basically.
Yeah, certainly. Congratulations for that. I think that was really a unique case, seeing how the technical community, which is also really decentralized, is not a homogeneous something, interacted directly with the policymakers to change the really important piece of a legislation, and to see how actually concrete improvements were made. I think that's really, really unique, and it's a big achievement. But I myself personally expected that many of the communities probably would be ignorant to that particular issue, because many those who are involved regard political policy nuances too complex, maybe something that is not included in the area expertise for them. And I still see that, the sort of stigma between the policy and the technical people, that they have different fields of work, and it's rarely that they actually need to talk to each other. So I wonder whether you encountered the same issues reaching out beyond Linux Foundation to the other communities, and how you raised the awareness, whether there was any lack of response, let's say, from the others.
First of all, this is a multi-layered issue. And what I mean by that is that we not only have technology communities that say, I don't care about regulation, I just release my software for free and it doesn't matter. Like, it's up to people what they want to do with that, which is actually a valid point if you think about it. But we also have an issue of, this is a European regulation, or we engaged in Europe in a European legislative debate. And there are lots of people outside of Europe who said, why should I care about that? It took a long time for people to realize that if you have a horizontal market regulation in Europe, that it affects manufacturers in Japan. And so we not only had an awareness issue in the open source community, we also had awareness issues with manufacturers in and outside of Europe. And so a lot of what we did is basically presenting over and over again how this will affect both the communities and the market, and that we need to be at least aware of what's coming, and that we need to make ourselves heard. Yeah, so a lot of this was basically evangelizing to our own communities to say, please get engaged. There is a disconnect between policy and technology, but maybe one aspect to keep in mind here is that while the open source community is not primarily a political movement, but mostly releases technology, what technology gets developed and how it changes our society is a political aspect, and open source is really driving that. The technology stock of our societies when it comes to digital technologies today builds, for the most part, on open source. essentially all basic technologies or basic building blocks for software components that we're using today are developed first as open source. And with that in mind, it also policymakers needed to see that involving the open source community in this process is important. So there was this the concern that was raised that the various open source communities and organizations, they got too much influence in this discussion. A manufacturer said, that's just one part of the ecosystem. Why does open source get so much attention also in the text of the law? And the counter argument is that we assume that all digital products today, in terms of software, contain about 80% open source components. And that means you can estimate that about half the software in the market that is shipped in commercial products even is probably open source. So yes, it's special treatment, but it's special treatment for 50% of the market, which I think is justified. But this awareness issue and the issue of engaging in the right way and the right discussions is one that continues, that we still have, and it gets exacerbated, by the sheer number of regulatory initiatives that are coming towards us that all in a way affect digital products. And it's very simple today. If you influence how software is being developed, you influence the open source ecosystem, because we're a very large part of the software development scene, if you will.
And you mentioned the new role that the CRA established specifically for you, those stewards.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you would unpack a little bit of what precisely it means and what was the final compromise that the adopted law has, and what sort of the role it created for the open source community.
So first, I wouldn't call this a compromise because it's a very principled approach. It's more, we needed some time to develop this understanding collectively, and then it was formulated in the later versions of the CRA. So it's not a compromise compared to the initial version. So that's really a new concept. And what the Cyberspace Act does, it basically defines two economic operator roles, one of manufacturer and one of open source software steward, or stewards as we call them in short, recognizing that they really play different roles with different incentives and motivations in the market. Manufacturers are what manufacturers have always been, companies that create commercial products and bring them into the market. But what the law recognizes is that organizations like us don't do that. We make technology available, but we don't bring it into the market as a specific concrete product. We make it available in a similar way to how science is made available. We publish it, and then we leave it to the world to do something with that in a way. And we also don't necessarily engage directly. We don't track who uses the software. There's a disconnect. It's not a contract in that regard. It might be a contract with regards to licensing, but there's no negotiation between our users and us. We don't have a relationship directly necessarily. And this really separate and unique role of the open source software steward is now explicitly formulated in the law. And if you have two roles, you basically require a delineation of responsibilities. And the way this is done is that the responsibility for introducing a commercial product into the market, even if it includes open source components, is very clearly placed on the manufacturer that does that. If you read the text carefully, you see a clause that says, if a manufacturer consumes an open source component, it is their due diligence to decide if that component is fit for the purpose and secure and can be introduced into the market. And from my perspective, this represents very much the reality on the ground, because it's, of course, a free will decision of a manufacturer to use or not to use a component. And a manufacturer is very keenly aware that the license condition says there's no guarantee. You offer the software for free for any purpose, but it's on you to decide if it's okay for you to use it. And the law represents this very well. So that's why I say it's not a compromise from my perspective. It is actually a realization of how the software ecosystem works today. And I think that's both scary in a way, because regulation is starting to change based on the special role that the open source ecosystem plays in building technology. And it's a huge opportunity, because I think it's, from an approach, it's quite a step forward.
Yeah, I would agree. And by the way, we came to the similar conclusions with an earlier past years within Geneva Dialogue when we discussed the distribution of the roles between the open source community and the manufacturers. So there was the same conclusion that the due diligence and the responsibility for the final products lies on the shoulders of the manufacturers. While the open source community is expected to contribute with the more secure products, but it's no legal responsibility for those part of the entire ecosystem. But to your last point, with this new change which CRA introduced to the entire, I think, software manufacturing practice, speaking globally, do you anticipate similar legislations in other countries?
That's a very good question. It's a question about the future, so we don't know. I would wish that at the European Union level, this example of how the CRA breaks down the roles of the different operators and makes their split of responsibilities explicit can be adopted in a wider fashion. Because I see it as an improvement over the mentions of open source software in other laws that currently exist, which usually don't really go into how the market works. They just say open source software is treated somewhat differently, some way, like non-commercial open source is excluded, which makes us cringe in a way, because that's not how we think about this. So we hope that the European Union adopts a similar approach in various other places over time. Would be good. How will other regions and countries respond to that? I understand that the European Commission wishes for like a Brussels effect outcome here with the Cyber Resilience Act, so basically trying to export the regulation, influence other markets indirectly. There's also a chance that if the approach is successful, that other countries will emulate it. That has been done before with European law. If it's good, it gets adopted in other places. If it's not so good, other people also learn from that and do it differently. So yes, I think considering that this really represents a lot of how the software ecosystem works, I would expect that similar approaches get adopted in other places as well. But that's as I said, kind of a prediction about the future. So
yeah. But interestingly, we still haven't seen some concrete proposals like CRA in other countries, neither like Singapore or some advanced legislation jurisdictions in other countries.
The legislative approaches very differently here, very massively here. The EU took on cybersecurity as a market access regulation. Approached it with the CRA, saying, if you want to bring products into the market, these are the requirements you have to fulfill. For example, the EU also applies certification to CE mark to communicate that you do that. That's a pretty unique approach. Other regulatory approaches tackle this via product liability or various different ways. So I'm not sure, for example, if that's all we need for cybersecurity. There are two aspects about this. One is regulating cybersecurity as a market entry criteria means we can only catch good actors, people that want to abide by the law. And we have quite recently, with the XC vulnerability, with the attempted introduction of malicious code into an open source project, seen that not all actors are good actors. And actors who are trying to do something like that, they will not be deterred by a law that regulates what well-acting manufacturers should do. And so, yes, this is not everything we need about cybersecurity, basically, is what I'm trying to say. The other aspect is, I think the open source community in the past has actually done a lot more than what the Cyber Resilience Act is considering. There's whole discussion of supply chain security, of best practices that are applied across the whole ecosystem, of code reviews that focus on security. I think actually there's a lot more to cybersecurity than just what we're discussing in the Cyber Resilience Act. And we are currently engaging in a analysis of that, like the best practices of leading open source projects versus what the Cyber Resilience Act requires, with the goal to identify these gaps, like both what does the community not yet do that the Cyber Resilience Act requires, and also what did the community do before that is not included there and should still be a best practice.
I would probably agree here. Maybe you would disagree with me that once reading the first proposals of the CRA, I didn't see that as actually introduce some novelties in the way what the industry needs to do. So it was really relied on the huge bulk of the existing voluntary good practices which industry developed over the past 20 years or less. But it was really important in the way that it's clearly said that now those who develop products are responsible for the security, and they would be consequences if they do not follow those obligations. I think that's I don't know whether that would really have a significant effect in the way that we will see tremendously more secure products, or at least more mature practices from the manufacturers to deal with different deficiencies, vulnerabilities, and other aspects. But that was really, really important. And here I have another question related to this voluntary good practices that exist already for many years. How the Linux Foundation particularly interacts with other bodies, if it interacts at all, such as maybe NIST or others, to help them also to make sure that when they develop different guidelines and recommendations, the voice of the open source community is also heard. Or maybe you have some established cooperation with such other communities.
So I'm not the best person to answer this question because I'm not always involved in all the discussions. For example, in the US, we focus primarily on Europe with our work. But I can say that especially Open Source Security Foundation has well-established ties into US politics. And there have been dialogue opportunities between the open source community and, for example, the US government. Mostly we see our role here as advisors. We basically say we don't really have a primary political interest. We focus, except that we want the way that we develop technologies to be supported and facilitated and not impinged on. Since people, including policymakers, see the positive impact we have on technology innovation and generally software quality and availability of software, I think we have a strong voice. So we are being consulted. This happens in different places, including the EU and in the US. But yeah, I can't say much more about the relationship that we have or the collaboration that's ongoing there because I'm not day-to-day involved in it. But during the discussions with the Cyber Resilience Act, at some point it felt like the United States government was listening more to us than the EU. But over time, this has, as I said, like the relationship to the EU has also improved during the debate, improved in the sense that we have been seen more and more as advisors, as we like to be, as representatives of a otherwise mostly non-political stakeholder group, but with a strong technology interest. So today, I would say relationships are good and productive in both directions.
Are you a part of any established sort of information sharing structures, partnerships with the certs, or responsible competent authorities at the national level and the EU and the EU level, in the way that if there's a sort of security vulnerability is found? So I imagine that such structures exist between such bodies and the companies, but is the open source community also part of this, or is not really common practice?
I know we're part of this, but as I said, I'm not the deep expert on this topic. We have good relationships, especially in Europe, with the different national security bodies, the CERTs, and also with the NISA at the EU level. And one thing, of course, that is coming is that the Cyber Resilience Act requires the establishment of a single reporting platform, and also requires open source software stewards to collaborate with market surveillance authorities when necessary on cybersecurity vulnerabilities. So this aspect will definitely see a detailed review and probably changes in how we run our projects and engage. But if you're more interested in that, I can probably create a connection, establish a connection to the Open Source Security Foundation. That is our organization that focuses on these aspects.
And one of the last questions within this topic on the security, I also wanted to roll back that you mentioned that you're doing the work to see what kind of the probably missing gaps exist to make sure that they're in line with this year, right? Or maybe what already you as a community have done. So maybe you could share some sort of the insights that you learned. What are the missing gaps? What is currently the most problematic areas that you see you need to focus on in the way to ensure that security of the open source projects is increasing?
So first of all, at the beginning of this research, so I can't really recite the results yet. But what we're looking at is basically we analyzed the concrete requirements that the Cyber Resilience Act establishes for manufacturers, for reporting by all parties, and for stewards. And we are then assessing projects that always had a cybersecurity angle and therefore have very well-established practices in this regard, and assess these projects against the requirements that we see. The outcome could be both a gap or the realization that the projects are actually really well established and even go beyond what the Cyber Resilience Act requires. And this is the research that we currently do. And one aspect, or one reason why we do this now, is that with the vote in the EU Council, the Cyber Resilience Act has concluded as a political debate, from my perspective. We've engaged in shaping it, but now we need to engage in implementing it. This is a change that we're making. We're focusing more on the relationship between stewards and, for example, market surveillance authority, which is more of a hard requirement coming out of the law. But we're also focusing on the relationship between stewards and manufacturers. So how do manufacturers consume our software in a secure way? How they report back vulnerabilities that may need to be fixed upstream? And this is more like a soft requirement. This is not established in this area. It does not say the manufacturers need to become members in the foundation if they use their software. It's just that it might be a good way both for the manufacturers to achieve their goals of long-term software support and for us to maintain the projects that they rely on. And these soft requirements are, I say soft requirements because the law doesn't very explicitly say what us and manufacturers need to do. But this is, I think, where most of the value can be generated. Because if we can generally adopt stronger processes, more focus for cybersecurity in the development process and along the supply chain, so that manufacturers can fulfill their requirements. I think that's the actual intended effect of the Cyber Resilience Act. It's not just the marking of the product itself. It is the influence of on the supply chain. And a key aspect here is the imposition of long-term product support periods. So the CRA says 5 years or more in most cases is how long a manufacturer needs to provide cybersecurity updates for a product. And that's a truly tough requirement. For example, if you're consuming upstream open source components, you need to be sure that you can rely on them for 5 years after the last product that you sold in the market, which might be overall a period of 10 or 15 years. And so as a manufacturer, you have a very strong interest to make sure that this upstream community is healthy and viable and will continue to operate. And that creates not a mandatory, but a recommended or intended relationship between the manufacturers and the stewards. So now we are investigating basically what we as the Linux Foundation can do to be a good steward that manufacturers can work with.
Yeah, and you responded my questions about this impact of the legislation on the existing relationships between the open source community and the commercial vendors. but it's quite interesting. I wanted to also touch a little bit on the geopolitical environment that we see, because there was a recent report, and that again triggered a lot of a discussion in the community, specifically with regard to the growing fragmentation between different jurisdictions, between different blocks of the countries, that affects the technical community and the people who work in this field. So maybe you would share if you feel the same sort of the pressure coming from the current geopolitical situation that affects the collaborative nature of the open source community across the borders.
So first of all, geopolitics is also not one problem. It's a whole set of problems. So we have trade tensions, parties to accuse others of, for example, subsidizing industries to undercut manufacturers in other regions. We have international security tensions, sanctions in place, and many other things. And first thing, the open source organizations like us, we are open for collaboration by any interested parties, and we share our results with everybody, but we still exist within a regulatory framework. And if the country that we are in imposes sanctions on another country, then that will restrict and limit the kind of work we can do. This has recently affected our work. I think that's what you're referring to, where we had to remove the role of maintainer from some contributors who were affected by sanctions because of the geopolitical situation. And like the explanation behind this is a maintainer is responsible for more than their own work. A maintainer is the person that is able to approve or disapprove the work of others. And that means you have to work with a maintainer. So that is clearly something that if that person is under sanction, you might not be legally allowed to do. And so we had to take an action to remove that maintainer role from individuals who were affected by sanctions. Just want to make it clear that these individuals can still contribute to the software. So the development process is still open to them. They just cannot judge the work of others. Mm-hmm. It's a very tender compromise. And it's generally something that you may feel is well, not in line with the spirit of openness, but that's why I started with, we are all living in a legal environment and a political environment, and we cannot disconnect ourselves from that, also not as an open source organization. Mm-hmm. There are easy way outs. I mean, don't work for a sanctioned entity or don't invade other people's countries. And then you will not have that problem. So I think there's a certain justification behind the move. But it's generally, this is exactly where normally the open source community would defer to openness and open collaboration, and not always is that something we can do.
And we discussed this. I recall that I also wanted to ask you more specifically about the type of the relationship that you have as the entity, as a community with the contributors and maintainers. So if there's a sort of the lack of response coming from those maintainers, and you don't see that they as sort of responsible as you wish them to be, what kind of the sort of the ways you have to influence the behavior of the maintainers?
This is exactly where we need to understand that open source is about technology, mm-hmm. and that the work of a maintainer, 99.9%, does not have a political component. Mm-hmm. So for the most part, we don't interfere with the work of the maintainer. So the maintainer, being a person that feels responsible for an open source project, maybe has been appointed to this role or has evolved into this role because it's a community project, and being more deeply involved in the project compared to contributor who contributes code but does not take responsibility for the whole project. So normally our projects pick their own maintainers in a meritocratic way, meaning if you stand out as somebody who works on a project for a longer period of time, who regularly contributes, or who is seen as a thought leader or like a center of expertise for the project, then usually people get pulled to be maintainers. They don't even ask for it. It's a badge of honor in a way that people recognize the value of your work. And we don't need to police the maintainers for the most part. Like the projects are self-governed in a way that we come back to this point. There is no outside authority for the projects, really. Like it's the projects are made of the contributors of the project, and that means what's best for the project is probably decided by the people that contribute to it, and the maintainers or the technical steering committee where they're organized is the entity that there's the highest authority in the project, basically. We do have safeguards in place, for example, about conduct, basically about being a nice person and allowing others to also be their best. But these are also soft issues because human behavior is not completely standardized. So mostly we say, as long as a discussion is focusing on the technical merits and the development process, we try to keep personal things out. And in that, open source is a very welcoming environment. It allows very diverse people to collaborate. And because of that, we don't usually have a need to police maintainers, which is why what we talked about earlier, the removal of maintainers because of sanctions is a very unusual step. And it's because of this additional constraint that we're also operating in a political environment that we don't set, but we have to respect.
Yeah, that was a pretty, I think, cultural move, which was really forced to think a lot about the reality that we live in. I agree with you that we cannot really fully disconnect us from the reality check, the legal environments that we operate in. And I wonder, what are your sort of view, whether, I don't want to be binary, but as optimistic or pessimistic when you're looking ahead on how the overall globally the tech and cyber environment developed, which is highly political already, whether this would have a rough and negative impact on the established spirit of openness of the open source community, and the spirit of openness to collaboration, accessibility to everyone who wants to contribute, and also to conduct properly in line with the principles of that community. Or you would rather say that that's maybe a measure that might exist for some time, but in the future we will manage somehow to to go back and overcome the sanctions and the other measures, restrictive measures.
At the various levels of political influence on the open source ecosystem, the market regulation, I think, will not negatively affect the willingness to collaborate. First of all, it applies to all open source communities the same way. So whether you are based in Europe or somewhere else, it makes no difference. And also, maybe to put a slightly different touch on this or note, everything the Cyber Resilience Act requires is something that we are all working for. All the all the policy goals behind it are something we can totally sign up for. So the community does not negatively react to the policy goals that are being pursued. So I think it's an overall win. So at this level, the open source community is focusing on, is based on collaboration and will continue to do so. In international relationships, we always had a bit of a cultural separation, mostly based on languages and time zones. And so we have different regions of open source in the world, basically. And sometimes they don't interchange information as much as they could. Maybe AI will help with that, with automatic translation in the future. I'm actually really hopeful about that, because there are literally code bases where the comments are in Brazilian language, Brazilian Portuguese, and I can't read that, but maybe AI can translate that for me, and then it makes it easier. And at the third level, so we had market regulation, we had cultural distance or gaps. And then we have, of course, international security. And there, of course, I hope that we can overcome sanctions, but that means for international security to improve and for aggressive behavior to stop. And of course, we would be open to collaboration as soon as the sanctions goes away at the level that was there before. So it's almost like it impinges on our work. We accept that it does not. But of course, we hope for it to go away.
But it does impact those intangibly, the trust that existed in a community, right? When like 10 years ago, maybe there was not really such concerns, but now even the sanctions formally are no longer the issue. The trust is something really difficult to build up again.
Yeah, agreed. So trust is pretty much everything in open source because with two dimensions of what we do. One is the licensing, the availability, how we share the results, and one is how we collaborate on the development. And if you don't trust people, then you don't collaborate with them. That's a very simple takeaway here. I don't think that this action, which is discussed very loudly in the press, and people have strong opinions about this action will not affect trust within the community as much as those people say, because they're actually not part of that community. It would be advisable to look at the reactions of the actual kernel development community that was affected here, to see that the reactions there are quite rational. They see it as a necessary step and they accept it. And so means the impact on the trust within, like trust with your to your peer group, to your collaborators, is probably not as much. And I think a lot of it hinges on, in the long term, how can we overcome the outside environmental situation that affects us? And then how can we go back to where we were before, hopefully?
And I have a last question, of course, about AI. Thank you also for mentioning this as an excellent bridge to my last question. And also the questions about the future, about some attempts to fantasize a little bit, whether you believe that AI would significantly change the way how open source community work, in the way how the code is written, and how you as the community, also the maintainers, can quicker identify vulnerabilities and maintain software security.
I think overall the impact of AI will be super positive. And as you said, exactly, AI can do work that is very difficult for humans to perform just from a scale of the complexity, like not the complexity, but the scale of information that needs to be processed. For example, I worked on a recent research paper where we had to judge the complexity of open source software releases, of all of them, of 100,000 of releases. No humans can do that, but AI can, and it does it really well. So we can get tasks done that we couldn't do before. I mentioned that I believe that AI can help us overcome the cultural and language gaps between kind of the different segments of the open source ecosystem, which I really believe can happen, will happen, because automatic translation of comments or code will be is almost there today, so it's not completely in the future. Another aspect is the generation of source code, taking drudge work out of the hand of developers and automating it, something that was always very difficult. There are also challenges here, but overall, I think it will be a positive impact. We're still at the beginning of it. We're still trying to find out what exactly these benefits will be. But I think the chances, opportunities I mentioned, like closing cultural gaps, increasing the developer efficiency, will all be beneficial for the open source ecosystem. And of course, beyond that, we have the issue of what is AI, what is open source AI, and how can it be regulated? But this is really a separate question from how does it benefit the development process that we as communities implement?
When we speak about the regulation, it by default means that we already are aware of certain risks that we want to sort of mitigate for us. But I would have rather agree with you that AI would be definitely a really super powerful tool, which would help with the automation of the existing challenges. As you mentioned, there's a lot of interdependencies. There's a lot of different work to be done, and the human eye and the human brain is really not probably equipped enough to deal with this. But I wonder if AI, there's a view that we may have too much code, and because of the increasing complexity of the software that we use, there might be actually more risks
Mhm.
that we
Yeah,
need to
so
look at this. So whether you think that AI would be accelerating, creating too much code, which is not always actually needed.
we have two competing effects here. One is that people generate code with AI and then maybe don't understand it as well anymore as
Mm-hmm.
before. And then the other effect is that we have AI to analyze code and look for security vulnerabilities. And I hope that the second aspect will accelerate more than the first and that we will get more secure software. But generally, I see maybe this is because of the early stage that we're in with the adoption of AI, that right now, the AI applications that like image generation and text generation, etc., that are popping up everywhere, they're mostly used to produce lots of low-value content, from tons of images to tons of text. And I know that the Wikipedia community is dealing with this problem massively. I hope that we'll get over that at some point. If we want to make AI a positive impact, then we have to get rid of the low-quality hallucinations that it produces and make sure they don't end up in our software. In the end, cybersecurity is still always about somebody being responsible, and that somebody is usually a human. So I think we cannot fully rely on AI to find vulnerabilities, for example. And we should not fully rely on AI to develop code. And this balance of the AI is a tool for us to write more and better code and to assess software more deeply and diligently for vulnerabilities. This is what we need to get to. But I'm quite optimistic from what I see that this is also the direction that we're taking. So yeah, I'm an optimist when it comes to technology.
Thank you so much, Mirko. I've really enjoyed the conversation. We in the Geneva Dialogue really try to separately look at the open source community's role in the overall implementation of those diplomatic cyber norms, but more specifically to look at what specific roles and contributions the open source community does. And unfortunately, it's still very much overlooked in the discussions between the policymakers and the tech. So I really enjoyed the conversations, and I hope that our audiences will do as well. And thank you so much again.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.